Gentlemen, we have with us on the stage Dr. Ashok Khosla. Dr. Khosla founded and was president of the 30-year-old Development Alternatives Group and now chairs its board. He is the co-chair of United Nations Environment Programme's International Resource Panel and is internationally known for pioneering and contributing to sustainable development. Dr. Khosla's contribution to the field of sustainability has been recognized and lauded with various awards, some of them being UN Sasakawa Environment Prize, Zayed International Environment Prize, WWF Duke of Edinburgh Medal, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, Schwab Foundation Outstanding Social Entrepreneur, Stockholm Challenge Award, Global 500 Roll of Honor of the United Nations Environment Programme, and the Golden Arc of the Netherlands Publications. Dr. Khosla also has more than 300 professional papers, articles, and reports to his credit. And ladies and gentlemen, I have the privilege in inviting him to address the audience. He would be speaking on why the conference, approach, and context. Please put your hands together to welcome him.
Thank you, Swapna. Dr. Ramzarai, Ranjit, Arun, and all my distinguished colleagues from so far back. I see in participants in the room people we've worked with for 20, 30 years on issues of this kind. We're going to be talking for the next 2 days about securing the forests, the land, and soils for the benefit of all citizens of our country. And the 2 or 3 things that seem to us missing in getting from here to where we need to go in these areas is technologies, knowledge, and policies. And we're going to look over the next 2 days at how we as thinking citizens can bring about the kind of changes needed in order for us to have a better future, not just for ourselves, but for future generations in our country and around the planet. I don't need to go into, I don't know what happened. I have to start all over again. Swapna has already told you a little bit about the Club of Rome. Started in 1968. It became a major force to be reckoned with in 1972 when it published a unique publication called The Limits to Growth. And in 1972, this was really in some ways an explosion, a kind of a nuclear explosion of the mind. For the first time, some people, very eminent people who had made it in life, the head of some of the biggest corporations in Europe, Aurelio Peccei, who basically was the head of Fiat and Olivetti and a large number of other companies, and about 30-odd people of great eminence came together, and already in 1972 they expressed a certain amount of concern about where the world was going. They were not really looking at poverty issues as much as you might wish, but they were certainly looking at what modern forms of industrialization were leading to in terms of degradation of the environment, in terms of breaking up of societies, of alienation, and they wrote these books called The Limits to Growth and The Predicament of Mankind, essentially raising issues that had never occurred to anyone before. These were unfamiliar issues, and they were reacted to very strongly by the existing establishment, particularly the economics profession. And it took about 30 years for people to realize that actually what was in the documents was something of importance. It was only by the end of the century, by the year 2000, that people around the world started to realize that there was a great deal of foresight in what the Club of Rome had written. Now, being the first think tank gave it a huge positioning, a standing in the world of intellect. So when during the course of the years I was privileged to become president of the World Association, the Club of Rome, for about 7 years. I realized how powerful this mechanism was for influencing policy, for influencing areas of research in academia, for influencing media. The Club of Rome just had a built-in strength in terms of being able to reach people with new ideas, with questioning the way things are today and how to bring about change. So I decided that it was basically a good idea to see how to replicate that strength in India. And Dr. Ramdorai, Ranjit Bhattakur, a few others got together, and we came to the conclusion that it would be a useful thing for us to have a platform for debate about these issues in India. At first we thought, why don't we call it the Club of Delhi or the Club of India? And indeed that may have been more appropriate. But because of the positioning and because of the branding of the Club of Rome, we came to the conclusion that we might as well ride piggyback on the strength of its place in people's society. For example, when I was president of the Club of Rome, the president of Germany, Dr. Ashok Khosla, told me that when he was 23, when the book Limits to Growth came out first, it was the most dramatic, influential single event in his life. He never actually forgot how fundamental a change that brought about in his thinking. He later became the head of IMF, later he became president of Germany, but throughout, and I have met hundreds of people, including heads of state and government, who've said more or less the same thing. So now we are in position in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century that brings us to really recognize how complicated the issues are, how complex the interactions between all the problems are. And so we've convened these meetings, and during the year we have other events, to see whether we can apply that kind of thinking and that kind of positioning to influence policy. So the Indian National Association is very proud to be able to bring together eminent people like you as partners, as people who can help us first formulate the messages that we want to convey to the powers that be, but also to convey them, to communicate them. This is going to be an interactive 2 days. There will be a certain amount of introductory speeches to lay out the frameworks, but they are open-ended. We are really here to debate, not to be lectured to. You will see in the back there are boards over there, and in case we don't have the time for every single person attending this meeting to be able to have his or her say, your thoughts can be recorded, and they will get into the documentation and our communication packages when we try to talk to government or to corporations or civil society or to academia about what we think needs to be done to make India a better place. So please treat this as your meeting. You can interrupt when you wish. We will be opening up a dialogue just now after my speech for a little while so that we can put on the table the big issues. Now, we're not looking for personal anecdotes. We're really not looking for individual pet theories. We're looking for the big picture in which our organization, the Indian Association of Club of Rome, is able basically to use the strength, the ability of people like those gathered here to be able to influence. The whole purpose of this is to bring about change, and you can only bring about change when people listen to you, and they listen to you because they know that there's a huge amount of intellectual effort that has gone into what you say. Limits to Growth, as I say, came out in 1972. It was dormant for about 30 years because the economy kept on growing, the population kept on growing, everything, GDP went up, kept on growing. And so everybody said, well, where is this resource limitation? Where are the problems that the Club of Rome used to talk about, of pollution, of crashing population and food supply? Well, the Club of Rome never said that. They said that if we go on the way we are going, by the year 2100, which is still another 80 years away, we will have real problems. And basically, if you look at the I'm sorry, you don't have the slide. I think we better switch to the slides because they can see me. May I request the powers that be to come back to the slides? The curves of the Club of Rome's limits to growth were basically collapsing. Is that how you do it? Oh, that's fine. No, you were on it. Okay, so if you see the right-hand one, that's the third edition, 30 years after it was originally written, and you see that the original, not a forecast, not a prediction, but a warning that if we don't change our ways, all our beautiful industrialization, all our beautiful food supplies, everything at some point would start collapsing. So we have in our country great progress over the last 60-odd years. We've gone out to space, we've huge educational systems, healthcare systems, and there are 400 million people, more than the entire continent of Europe, who live good lives. They are basically middle-class citizens with great expectations and great hopes for the future, and it's a wonderful country for them. But then, on top of that, you have about 800 odd million who got left behind. Now this is another country, Bharat. It exists in the same space, same time, but very little interaction other than in the service of India. India is a pretty well developed country, and Bharat exists more or less like a sub-Saharan African country. So we have major problems, and the problems that we're going to deal with today are those of our lands, our forests, and our soils, which are rapidly disappearing. And this poor little girl, who for me represents Mahatma Gandhi's idea of Antyodaya, the last person who got left behind, is asking, what did we do for her? How did we come to this stage where she and her two little brothers, by the way, there's a little brother in there hidden away in her lap, how did they basically get so far left behind? So we decided about 3 or 4 years ago, as Ranjit mentioned, that we would do a series of events, our annual conferences. And the first one we held was in 2014, which was called Food for All. It was actually quite a seminal event. We had wonderful people. Dr. Swaminathan was here, Professor Alag was here. We had people from all over the world come to that meeting to look at the systemic issues, the deep underlying structural issues of the economy, of our agricultural science, of our land and water resources that impact the ability for every single citizen to be reasonably well fed. And the report of that, which is lying outside, you can have a look at it, which looks pretty close in picture to the one which we released today, is available. The second conference, that was last year, 2015, we had, was the one for which this report was released today. The Water for All was a major contribution, and not just for all, but for all uses, for agriculture, irrigation, for drinking water, and particularly for ecosystem uses. Today, this is the third of the series, we're dealing with forests, land, and soil, to which I will come back in a second. The next 2 years, we've planned a series of events. Our country and our city is filled with meetings on energy, because that seems to focus the mind a lot. So we didn't want to just deal only with energy. We thought we would really look at resources, material resources, energy next year, and we will get into some depth in that. For the last 10 years, I have been chair of the United Nations International Resource Panel, so we have a huge amount of research, very high quality, frontier level research done in this area, so we can feed a lot of that into our work. And basically, we've produced 20 odd reports, 2 of which are here, on land, on food systems, on water, and on all other resources. 4 or 5 of which are directly related to today's subjects of forests, lands, and soils. Um, then finally, not maybe, I have a little bug in here. Finally, we will be doing in 2018 a wrap-up session, process, a year-long process on livelihoods for all. How do you create jobs that are meaningful, dignified, and reasonably well paid with all this information that we've gathered on resources? This is a little bit of a problem. I'm afraid. Thank you. So, what did Rabindranath Tagore say? Rabindranath Tagore said, "Trees are the earth's endless effort to speak to the listening heaven." And I would add, forests are to regenerate its own living systems. Forests lie at the heart of life on earth. Teddy Roosevelt, at the beginning of the century, roughly about the same time as Tagore said what he did, said, "A people without children would face a hopeless future. A country without trees is almost as helpless." So trees, according to great thinkers, are great and important. But according to scientists, they're fundamental. They are essential for life on earth. About land, we will be talking about land. Mark Twain said, "Buy land, they're not making it anymore." And he got to the heart of the matter. Land is one of the most finite resources, and it's true by multiple cropping, by multiple uses, and you can expand its use a little bit, but frankly, ultimately, they don't manufacture it anymore. And Mahatma said, to forget how to dig the earth and tend to the soil is to forget ourselves. Very funny how these great people come right to the heart of the matter. And indeed, Franklin Roosevelt, from real experience of the Dust Bowl in the Midwest of the US, said, "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." Enough of quotations. I just wanted to say that we're now in big company at stratospheric levels thinking about issues much, much bigger than things like demonetization and who's doing what to whom in UP. This is the stuff that is going to determine the future of our children. And it doesn't make the headlines. So why you and I are gathered here together is to find ways in which to bring it to a higher level of attention. These reports that we've been writing in the UN Resource Panel include one on forests, like this one, and like these two on land and soils. So we've drawn a great deal from them. You know, you'll be very happy to know that India is the first country in the world that has actually set up a national resource panel, which is quite interesting because usually it's the West that drives these kinds of agendas. But we actually have a government which was sensible enough to realize that in addition to climate change, in addition to species loss and biodiversity, extinction of species and biodiversity loss, resources are going to be a major constraining factor for the health and well-being of our people. So we actually in India happen to have set up a mechanism, an official mechanism to look at this. It hasn't got fully activated yet, it's got to do a lot more work, but I think we can congratulate ourselves in realizing that we're not always behind, following and catching up. Now, the purpose of these 2 days is very simple. We're going to answer these 5 or 6 big questions. And I need your help in doing that. And as I said, there's a board, 2 boards, 4 boards actually, out there at the back, where all your opinions and ideas that you would like captains of industry, political leaders, civil society leaders, academics to think about now for the future. We're talking about specifically our set of ecosystem services, ecosystem resources, and that says the first question that we would like to go with answers to, or help in finding answers to tomorrow evening, is how healthy really are our India's forests, land, and soils. I'll come to a few statistics in a minute, but I think this is a question that really deserves a better answer than we're getting at the moment. Secondly, what institutional and technology changes are needed to improve these forests, land, and soils. Thirdly, what investments are needed in knowledge generation and sharing, innovation, communication, and other types of institutions. Fourthly, where should public and private focus be redirected? Where should we really be looking differently at these issues? And fifth, what structural changes can make our policies for these and other resources more coherent, more convergent, as Ranjit said earlier, more congruent, and mutually reinforcing? You know, the silos of the kind of government systems that we have, so do other countries, but we're concerned with ours, make it virtually impossible for one ministry to be able to, for sure, reinforce the policies of another. What happens in the Ministry of Energy has a huge impact on what happens in the Ministry of Environment or of Water, and since they don't speak to each other, the countervailing impacts, the counteracting impacts of those policies often neutralize each other completely. So we now need to figure out ways in which, without necessarily changing the major ministerial responsibilities, can we figure out ways in which our policies all pull in the same direction? Does making free energy available to agricultural farmers really produce the kinds of results for food security that you would like? Are these purely political, vote-gaining or money-making propositions, or are they really generally for the interests of the future of those resources? So we have actually numerous examples, and I'd like to reserve one of the boards for the insights you can help us put together of where contradictory policies are actually doing the opposite of what government intended. The unintended impacts of policies are sometimes bigger than the actual impacts that were directly expected. So we need really to give a great deal of thought to that, and one of the important outcomes of this kind of an exercise is eliciting examples, what we might make into case studies, to be able to demonstrate to the Minister of Environment or to the Minister of Industries or to the Minister of Water Resources, if you do this, you're going to end up with a suboptimal solution. Now, you all know about the ecological footprint. The footprint is now a pretty good science. Today, you can measure very accurately how many hectares of land one single individual needs to support him or her. Today, the ecological footprint of the world is roughly around 1.7 times the biocapacity of the world. In India, which happens to be just by coincidence roughly at the same average as the world, it's also about 1.6, 1.7. But it's growing very rapidly. At the time of independence, we were 0.3. We were using 1/3 the resources that the land of India was producing to feed ourselves, to live decently, and so on. Today, we're using up 70% more than the earth produces. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's very simple. Anybody who has a bank account knows that you can keep on drawing down your balance, but at some point that balance finishes, and then what do you do? And unfortunately, unlike the bank statement that comes every month, we don't know how fast we're crossing these two lines. And all of a sudden, you're over the cliff. So we have to now actually pay great attention. Today, there's a day in the year called Overshoot Day. Overshoot Day comes about 3 or 4 days earlier every year. I think this year it was mid-August. It was late August, by which time we had already used up the year's worth of resources. That's scary. Here's the overshoot. The ecological footprint is the blue line going down. The red line sort of going up, and the blue line is the biocapacity. And you can see that we are way over the limits, both as a country and as a planet. Now, what are the instruments for change? How do we redirect the way we're going? Well, the easiest way is technologies. We can always invent new technologies. We can get some engineers. We can design new things, and we can destroy the land with our technologies, with chemicals, with pesticides, with toxics, with heavy energy requiring bulldozers, or we can do it in ways in which you regenerate the land. Our lifestyles, and particularly our consumption patterns and production systems, you can see some of the examples in these pictures, are not in line with the needs of either the country or the planet. Our financial instruments, our fiscal policies, our incentives, our taxes, all encourage or discourage certain kinds of good behavior. And then there are policies. And we will be talking quite a lot about those today. Alternative technologies can be very different. This little dam on the right-hand side is a so-called check dam. It's one that my organization made in Bundelkhand, near Jhansi. And it's amazing. It's our answer to the Narmada Dam. It basically has returns on investment of the order of 500 to 1,000%. With that dam, a river that was dry for 7 months in the year became perennial. It took this land from 1 crop to 3. It basically brought the water into the wells and filled up the aquifers. Women didn't have to walk 4 hours a day to get water because it was right there in the well. There were fish, there was recreation, there was wildlife. There's huge numbers of impacts that little dam, which cost us 4.5 lakh rupees, brought into the society. It was a way of totally bootstrapping the economy. We can make jobs for people. That picture on the top left is a picture of a factory we have in Orcha, in Madhya Pradesh, recycling paper. Now these women, it's an all-women factory, we did that purposely, had been employed 20 years ago, 20 years earlier than when I'm talking about, for their need, not because they had talent, not because they were terrific workers, but because they were desperately in need of work. The only criterion we had was that they'd had 1 or 2 babies already. Now, 20 years later after we started, it was a profitable business, we make money on it, we came back to look at the impacts on their lives. Many of them were sarpanches, many of them were leaders in their communities in many different ways. But the most important and dramatic impact on their lives was that in comparison with the control group, another 25 ladies outside, their cousins, same age, same caste, same economics, financials, the control group had had 25 babies during this period. The ones in the factory had had 2. So you can imagine the kind of dramatic impacts that a livelihood for a woman can have. So we're talking about a different form of development, the kind of development that in the last 60 years hasn't happened, and the kind of development that in the next 60 years better happen if we're going to get the population under some kind of sensible regime and people's lives better. So these are all different kinds of technologies that can be used in villages and small communities to create jobs and to create products for satisfying basic needs. We need alternative institutions and livelihoods. Of course we need government. We need government to control foreign policy, defense. We need it for currency regulation, as we know, and a lot of other things. But a large part of governance that I think Ranjit was talking about has to be at the local level. Governance has to be by communities, for the communities. And a large part of the future of India lies in heeding Mahatma Gandhi's plea that we need village republics. We need to nurture governments and governance at the local level. Now we come to policy coherence. Over the last 3 or 4 years, our own organizations, both Club of Rome and Development Alternatives, have been very heavily involved in the formulation and adoption of what is called the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals, and these goals relate to everything from poverty and hunger to sustainable consumption and conservation of nature. These 17 goals are extremely important. They have been adopted by virtually all the countries of the world, by heads of state that came to New York last September, and we know that there is a certain amount of government commitment to them. Now the question is, can we reach them? Can we fulfill them? On the bottom left, you will see what is called policy incoherence. We have different kinds of policies, and they all go off in different directions. On the right, we have a little diagrammatic description of what policy coherence might look like. That it's intertwined, that it's like a strand which basically reinforces each other. Each policy reinforces the other. This is basically what we would love to hear from you on how we could achieve that for our country. Yesterday's debate is all about fragmented issues: human health, melting of glaciers, greenhouse gases, pollution, soil health, effects of globalization, extent of forest resources. These are the things we've been worrying about in the past. The debate of today and tomorrow has to be basically about bringing together social, environmental, and economic issues together into one. You can't keep asking, do we have to trade off between development and environment? They are the same. There's no way that anybody living in Delhi can say we have development but we can't breathe. That's not development. There's no way that any of you can deny that we have made choices about development that were not appropriate. We could have had our cake and eaten it. We could have designed our development in such a way that we could at least go outside and breathe. Today, you can't even do that. So, we've got to understand that it's no longer possible to talk, as some interviewers over the last few days have been asking me, do we give up development for... It's not a question of giving up. You can have both, and you can have more of both if you design your choices correctly. And the purpose of this Club of Rome exercises is to see how to get those together. How do you have your cake and eat it? Participants in this exercise, as we saw earlier, we don't have enough people to whom we wish to be influential, particularly government. But otherwise, we've got leaders of civil society and academia and media, and I'm very happy to see that there are people here who can actually help us not only think through these things, but influence policy as a result. We have clearly defined our outcomes. I don't expect you to read them here, but essentially we hope at the end of this process not only to have a nice report like this one, the third one, but to be able to formulate specific targeted messages to each state government, each ministry, each type of corporation or business association. We would really like your help in making those so pointed that people cannot ignore them. So the outcome of this conference, as I say, is a report, of course, but various policy notes, consultations. We will, with your help, go and see the ministers and say that if you don't get your policies on energy and water and land sorted out, your forests will be gone. And we need to come back to those big questions. How healthy are forests and land and soils? What are the changes we need to make? What are the investments we have to now put, particularly into knowledge, innovation, and communications? And where should the focus of our thinking be? What is the purpose of the headlines in our newspapers or in our TV channels, which talk about nothing that is of any value to the future of this country? Virtually no value whatsoever. But that's all that they're concerned with. So we've really got to bring about a fundamental change. And as I said at the beginning, we see the platform that the Club of Rome India provides as a way for all of us to come and make that happen. You're all invited to become members of the Club of Rome. It's not very onerous, it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's a way of becoming a part of the future. And we hope that you will help us maintain some continuity, because when we have these kinds of meetings every year, looking at different resources, it really would help if we could build up some kind of an institutional memory by which we can take these things forward. That is basically the purpose of the 2 days. And I will basically come back to you a little bit after a copy on the substance, on each of the issues, on forests, on land, and on soils, and on waters, in a little bit of detail to provoke us to think about things we don't really normally think about. We've got to recognize, for example, that we're heading for an urban future that will require the use of so many resources that we may not be able to house everybody. Did you know that for making one brick, you need 1 kilogram of coal and you need 1 kilogram of topsoil? Did you know that? That means that every time you build a house, you're competing with food production. You're competing with carbon emissions. You're doing total damage if you build houses the way we've been building them for the last 100 years. We can't go on doing that. So we need to change not only the technologies, but the policies that help us change those technologies. Did you know that in China, whose example we want to follow in the way of infrastructure, for example, and quite rightly our infrastructure needs to be improved, did you know that in 3 years, 2009, 2010, and 2011, China used more cement, according to Bill Gates, than the US used in the entire 20th century. In the whole 100 years, the US used less cement than China used in 3 years of this decade. So we're talking about big issues, really big issues. It's not that who's going to lead which party is unimportant. Of course it's important. But these are the issues that are completely forgotten. And they're the ones that are going to really determine what kind of a future a country has. Thank you.